Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 14, Brain and Cranial Nerves. So as you know, the brain is part of the central nervous system. The brain along with the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. And we're going to have, as part of the peripheral nervous system, cranial and spinal nerves. So right now we're going to talk about the brain. And a little bit later in the chapter, we're going to talk about the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that attach to the brain and are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. Let's start with the brain and the 6 major regions of the brain. So I'm going to start really with these first two, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And these are some of the larger parts of the brain. So the cerebrum is the largest part. And that's this part right here. This is going to be where all your conscious thought arises. So this is going to be receiving information from the periphery, from your vision, from your hearing, smell, touch, taste, all of these things. It's going to be receiving information from the periphery. It's going to be processing it. And you're going to have your conscious awareness of it. And you're going to process it in the cerebrum. And then you're going to make some kind of decision and issue commands, say to skeletal muscles, based on the decisions that you've made. So, for example, if you wake up in the morning and you decide, I want French toast. And you get up and you think it's a cold day. Yeah, French toast would be great. So you go into the kitchen and you're going to be issuing commands to your muscles from this area of the brain right here to go into the kitchen. You'll pull out your pan. You're going to be planning your activities of how you're going to cook this French toast. And then you're going to have all kinds of information processing through here that's going to plan your actions. And then you're going eventually to issue the commands to the motor skeletal muscles that will then execute your idea and your plans. So the cerebrum is really where you're going to be making all of your conscious decisions, thoughts. This is where you become consciously aware of sensations, that is, sights, sounds that are coming from the periphery. This is also where you're going to have long-term planning, as I said, decision making, and so forth. Now, you'll notice that the cerebrum is quite folded up on itself. And the cerebrum is covered with a layer of gray matter that we call cortex. And cortex means bark. And cortex is where we have a lot of neuron cell bodies, dendritic fields, and some unmyelinated axons. So this is where a lot of the information processing is going on. In fact, anything that you become consciously aware of is going to be processed somewhere in the cerebral cortex. So if we were to look at the cerebrum, and I've got the model from the lab here that I have borrowed from the lab, you can see that it comes in two hemispheres. So there's a left hemisphere and there's a right hemisphere, which I've taken apart so that I can show some other structures a little bit later. But we have two cerebral hemispheres. And the cortex, which covers the outer surface, is going to be basically covering some white matter tracts that are underneath. And as you probably recall from previous discussions, the white matter is myelinated axons. So the white matter is going to be taking the information that has been processed from the cerebral cortex, and it's going to be conveying it either to other areas of cerebral cortex or other areas of the brain or the spinal cord. So basically, we will see that we have white matter tracts, which are kind of our information superhighways of the brain, and the central nervous system that are going to be carrying information both from the brain to other areas and also bringing information to the brain from the periphery. So these white matter tracts are going to be running up and down the spinal cord and all throughout the brain. So basically, when we talk about our central nervous system, we're talking about our brain and spinal cord, and when we talk about our peripheral nervous system, we're talking about everything attached to it. And to distinguish, like what we have said before, between white matter in the central nervous system, which run in tracts, versus white matter in the peripheral nervous system, which run in what we call nerves, we're going to have nerves attached to the brain that we call cranial nerves, and nerves attached to the spinal cord called spinal nerves. And these will all diverge all over the body so that we'll be able to have all kinds of sensory information from our fingers, from our eyes, our ears, and so forth. And all of that information is brought in on white matter. And once it reaches the central nervous system, then this white matter is called tracts. And we're going to have tracts that run the length of the cerebrum and run into some of these other areas in the cerebrum that we'll talk about, run from the cerebrum to other areas of the brain and into the spinal cord, and also bringing information via some of these peripheral nerves that are coming in, and then they will then synapse on neurons that are going to send axons through these tracts up into the brain, into the cerebrum, where information that they bring will eventually find its way to the cerebral cortex, can be processed, and then some decisions can be made based on that information, and then actions can be taken. So think of the cerebrum as your major planning center. This is the committees of your mind, so to speak, and they will basically be determining what you want to do given the information that you receive. All right, the next part of the brain I want to talk about is called the cerebellum, which is this blue part right here. And the cerebellum is also covered with a cortex. There's also white matter underneath. And the cortex, again, is gray matter. But instead of being sort of like these indentions here in the cerebrum, they're going to be a lot thinner. And we have different names for the types of infoldings that we see. So in the cerebrum, the infoldings that we see are called gyri. So basically the hills, if you will, are the gyri, and the little valleys between the hills are called sulci. So the hills, the convex part that stick out, are called gyri, and the little valleys between them are called sulci. So here's a gyrus. Gyrus is singular, and the sulci is this part right here, the sulcus. Singular is sulcus. And then in the cerebellum, which is this yellow part right here, they're called folia, which means leaves. And think about leaves like pages in a book. So that kind of leaf. So that looks like pages in a book almost. And all of this is gray matter. And you kind of wonder, well, why does it have these indentions like this? Why does it have these gyri and sulci? And the reason is that if you were to take gray matter as a flat sheet or try to wrap it around a spherical thing and fit it into a head, it would be huge. The head would have to be very, very large to contain it. So our cranial vaults are not that big compared to the rest of our bodies. So we have to have some way of fitting all of this cerebral cortex into our skulls. So the way nature has solved that problem is to fold it up into these little sulci and gyri. So you can imagine taking a flat piece of paper and kind of crumpling it so that it will fit into a space much more easily. All right, so that covers the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Let's talk a little bit more about what the cerebellum does. The cerebellum is very important for motor movements, for coordinating motor movements, and also for learning new motor movements. So what's going to happen is, let's say you learn a very complicated movement pattern, like a golf swing or something like that. The cerebellum is going to compare previous experience with your movement patterns and compare it to what's going on right now. So that as you are perfecting your golf swing and as you finally make your golf swing, then at that moment that you execute the golf swing, your cerebellum is going to be comparing what you're doing right now to what you've done before and adjusting your motor movements, your motor outputs to be the idealized motor output or come as close to it as it can. So what it does is it adjusts ongoing movements to make them fluid and smooth. So people who have cerebellar damage tend to have what we call ataxia. Their gait, that is their walk, tends to be unstable and they have herky-jerky movements. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Let's talk about some deep structures. So the diencephalon is a deep structure. And the diencephalon you can't really see in this picture, but you can see this outline that you can imagine is deep inside of there. And that outline is supposed to be the thalamus. And the thalamus is the major part of the diencephalon, which includes what we call the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. So if we look at the brain model here, you can see that this would be your thalamus. And just like you have left and right, this is the sagittal view, by the way, and just as we have left and right cerebral hemispheres, we have left and right thalami. So here's your thalamus. This is in the intact hemisphere. Over here, we've cut away the front part of the hemisphere so you can see the structures inside. And you can see part of the thalamus here as well. So the thalamus really does extend. It's kind of an egg-shaped almost thing. And there are two halves of it. And the thalamus is going to be a very important relay center that's going to bring information, or I should say receive information, coming from the periphery, and it's going to sort it and send it to its relevant processing area in the cerebrum. And the interesting thing about the thalamus is every single sensation that you have, with the exception of olfaction, that's a good test question, by the way, with the exception of olfaction, will pass through the thalamus before it reaches the cerebral cortex. So olfaction is the sense of smell, and we're going to have some olfactory bulbs out here, which we'll see a little bit later on. Here's an olfactory bulb, which will be receiving information from the nose. And that information will be carried back directly into the cerebral cortex, whereas all other information that we're going to get from our periphery, that is our vision, our hearing, our taste, our touch, all of these things will pass through the thalamus first before they reach cerebral cortex. And here's the thing. If it doesn't reach cerebral cortex, you're not going to be aware of it. You may sense that information. Something might be touching you, and it might be creating a sensation. But unless that electrical impulse gets past the thalamus, which is acting kind of as a gatekeeper now, and into the cerebral cortex, you're not going to be aware of it. And this is important because you're really only processing a very limited amount of sensory information at any given time. Otherwise, your brain would go into overload. So think about what you're doing right now. You're probably hearing all kinds of sounds in the background, maybe traffic, maybe dogs barking next door, maybe somebody's radio that they're playing, any number of things that you can tune out, literally, so that you're not aware of them anymore. So even sitting there with your clothes on, they're touching you and they're creating sensation. But are you aware of the sensation? Usually not unless it becomes bothersome or it requires your attention. So our cerebral processing up here is limited. We only have so many cerebral resources and so much cerebral cortex. So we can't dedicate a large part of our conscious awareness to things that don't matter. So things like, what our socks feel like, or, somebody's car horn or car alarm going off, 5 blocks away, probably isn't going to elicit our attention, or if it does, it'll be very brief and then we can ignore it. So basically, as I've said, everything that we become consciously aware of, with the exception of smell, has to pass through the thalamus. So the thalamus is a very important structure. Now, we also have two other structures in the diencephalon, one of which is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is this part right here. And so it's just below the thalamus, and it's very important in all kinds of processes in the body. So, for example, it coordinates neural and endocrine communication. So endocrine communication, as we'll find later, is going to be our hormonal communication or chemical signaling throughout the body. And the neural part of the hypothalamus is going to be important for regulating certain things such as our autonomic nervous system. And our autonomic nervous system, as you know, is going to be our automatic nervous system, stuff that we don't have to think of, stuff that's not going to reach our conscious awareness and we aren't going to be consciously thinking about. So, for example, our digestion. Typically, once we've eaten our meal and digestion begins on it, we don't think about movements of the stomach and secreting hydrochloric acid and enzymes. That's taken care of for us automatically. And we don't think about sweating, and we don't think about changing the diameter of the pupil in our eye to accommodate changes in light. So this is all part of the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system has its seat in this little part right here called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to be attached to a very important endocrine organ called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, you can see in the model right here, kind of hangs below the hypothalamus. And if you remember your sella turcica from your sphenoid bone, that hypothalamus, that pituitary gland, is going to sit in the sella turcica. So the pituitary gland, which hangs down below the hypothalamus, sits in that sella turcica and is a very important endocrine organ, which we'll study a little bit later when we get to the endocrine system. All right, we have one other part of the diencephalon called the epithalamus, and the epithalamus contains a little gland. You can barely see it, but it's right there, a little gland called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is going to be very important for regulating sleep-wake cycle, or what we call circadian rhythms. All right, now moving on from the diencephalon, we're going to look at these three structures kind of as a whole, because as a whole they are called the brainstem. So we're going to have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. As a whole, taken as a whole, they are called the brainstem. So here again, they've tried to show the midbrain in green, and you really can't see it on the model very well either, but it would correspond to this very little thin piece right here. And the midbrain is going to have several structures in it that we'll look at later on. And the midbrain is very important in two major things happen here. And there's several more that we'll talk about later, but I'll introduce two major functions right now, is one of which is they coordinate reflex movements to sights and sounds. So if a bright light goes off or something starts flashing in your periphery, then you're going to have reflex movements towards it so that you can see it, figure out what it is, and is it a threat to you or is it not? This is why we have some of these reflexes, and how are you going to react to it? But before you even become consciously aware of your reaction to it, if you see a bright light flashing in your periphery, you're probably immediately going to look at it. That's going to be mediated through structures in the midbrain. And likewise, if you have a loud noise nearby, you're going to orient yourself to where the noise came from. And that is going to be, once again, that reflex is going to be mediated through structures within the midbrain. Another thing that we're going to learn is important about the midbrain is it has an area called the substantia nigra, which literally is like just black stuff. And this is an area where dopamine will be made. And dopamine is very important for movement, as we will see. And when this area in the midbrain is destroyed, this area called the substantia nigra, and it's sort of in the anterior part of the midbrain, when it is destroyed, someone has Parkinson's disease because they no longer are able to coordinate their movement very well. So this is two major things about the midbrain that are pretty important. And we'll look at more in detail about the structures of the midbrain later on, but right now, suffice it to say that the two major functions that we're going to be focusing on right now are the fact that you have reflexes to visual and auditory stimuli that are mediated through the midbrain, through some structures in the back of the midbrain, and in the front of the midbrain, close to the front, you have this area called the substantia nigra, which is where dopamine is made, which is very important for coordinating motor movements and initiating motor movements. All right, next we have this blue structure here called the pons. And that would be this structure right here. And of course, we're only looking at the right side of it. If I were to put our little brain back together here, then we would see that we've got a bulging structure. So we have this structure right here. It's kind of a bulging structure that sits out front, and it has these very distinctive lines running across it called transverse pontine fibers. And I mention them now because they're a dead giveaway as to the structure. Pons means bridge, and it's bridging sort of hemispheres. It's going to have a series of longitudinal tracts that link the cerebellum with structures above it, such as the midbrain, diencephalon, and cerebrum, as well as structures below it, such as the spinal cord. The pons also has transverse pontine fibers that will link pontine nuclei on one side to the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. In addition to white matter tracts, we have nuclei, that is those gray matter connections, gray matter centers within the pons. They're going to be very important for autonomic function. And the medulla oblongata is also going to be an area where we're going to have a lot of what we call gray matter nuclei embedded within it. And that's going to be important, again, for autonomic function, for things like regulating heart rate, breathing, and so forth. All right, so that's sort of a brief overview of the brain. So next time we're going to pick up with some deeper structures, and we will talk about the meninges, and we'll talk about the ventricles, which are fluid-filled spaces. The ventricles are fluid-filled spaces within the brain, and the meninges are coverings that cover the brain, and they're both filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So we'll talk about that in the next segment.